be a profession is to have, part of being a profession is to have a code of ethics. Because the point of a profession is to serve a social need or a social requirement. And do it in a way that benefits society. So, the medical profession has things like the Hippocratic Oath, as well as other codes. There are codes for lawyers. Military ethics is a little more expansive than that, because it doesn't just deal with the kind of codes military professionals should live by, but it also deals at the policy level, which is where I tend to focus my work. So when should we use military force? If we should, and if we do use military force, what are the permissions and constraints and obligations and prohibitions regarding that use of force? And how do I make policies regarding that? And how does that policy become international law? So in one part of it is, like I said, the professional codes, the creeds, and the Army has its 10 ethical principles and the core values and that. On the other side is what is broadly described as the just war tradition, which has a long history, and it represents the attempt by human beings to kind of wrestle with all those questions over time. And these days, a lot of it's now codified in international law. So then the question becomes, how does that law or the philosophical principles that underpin it apply to military operations? And are those rules, laws, principles, and philosophical underpinnings adequate for the kinds of conflicts that we find ourselves in? Well, it's the same connection, I think, between the profession and ethics. An unethical profession is not a profession. An unethical leader is not really a leader. There's a big element that's now missing. Because ethical behavior is so important to the role, particularly of the Army, in accomplishing its mission for the nation, it can't do that without ethical leadership. Why? Because that would undermine the ethics of the profession, and we wouldn't have one anymore. And then there's obvious reasons too, right? We want leaders who don't just care about getting the job done, but also care about the people, their subordinates, in a way that motivates those subordinates to work harder. I mean, just think of it intuitively. How would you feel working for a leader you know to be unethical? Would you do whatever you would you just roll off your shoulders and you would just double down and work really hard? No, you probably work really hard when you believe your leadership is ethical. And without that, I think there's a very close tie between that ethical behavior and the effectiveness of the profession. You really can't pull the two apart, because ultimately it's that ethics that give the profession its legitimacy. And in the military context, that legitimacy then transfers to uses of force. And if you are perceived as using force illegitimately, you would then undermine the political objectives that force is trying to achieve. So you have to line it up all the way, or you just have violence and thuggery, and which is self-defeating in this context. And if you have to ask that question, then I say, then there's no understanding of, there's probably limited understanding of the rest of it. So I think the least understood part is why it's important and how it fits in to our normal reasoning. And part of it is not that people are unethical, because it's just so much of it's intuitive, right? I mean, you really don't spend most of your day, probably, wondering, am I doing the right thing? Because that's already embedded in your behaviors and your patterns and your routines. But when the matter is more urgent and the ethical question arises, and we feel that the ethical answer that we have is somehow restraining or a block or an impasse to the goal that we're trying to achieve, a lot of people want to say, well, let's just not worry about this then, or ethics has no place here, so it's being able to articulate why ethics has a place everywhere, and why there's no walking away from it. You can violate those principles, but there's a cost to pay. There's always a cost when you set aside ethical principles, and you saw it with our own dalliance with enhanced interrogation techniques. We're still paying for that. So when you ignore these concerns, and for the sake of necessity, you end up undermining the very thing you're trying to achieve. An important place that we need to start looking, because We're doing a lot of work at trying to understand what international competition and conflict is below that threshold. How do militaries fit in? And you can kind of see it playing out now, and you can see that the current norms associated with warfighting really don't apply as well. And in the context of the just war tradition, we kind of call that, you said VIM, which is justice below the threshold, justice of force below the threshold of war. And you were looking at, okay, what do we need to worry about? And you see, we're confused, right? So there was the response against Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, and the other strike that killed Qasem Soleimani, right? Was that wrong? Was it right? The U.S. claimed self-defense. Many members of the international community and some allies viewed that with skepticism. How do we settle that? What you're seeing is, and so you kind of have to take a step back. Okay, so what's the larger context in which all those actions and reactions actually happened? And what you see starting to emerge is the norms of conflict below the threshold of war, and this goes back to ontologies, things that we now have to kind of work into our ethics, are proxy forces. Are there norms associated with employing proxy forces? When it comes to using force, what about escalation? Do we have to worry about is escalation now a normative concept where that if I risk it in some way that I have violated some kind of norm because it facilitates the crossing of that threshold back into war, which is what you don't want to have happen in that area. And so, given the fact the law, and even where there is law, there's no real court to enforce it often, or how do states then regulate other state behavior? Well, they do that through reprisals, but those are currently using force in reprisals is currently illegal. I think you're going to see that tested over time, and I think there's going to be, and it's going to be tested because it won't be states are going to want to respond with force, even if there's no imminent self-defense requirement, and over time, if that happens enough, it becomes customary, so I think you're going to see pressure on that to find room for that kind of thing. I think in conjunction with that, you're going to see norms associated with escalation, and then in order to maintain and manage all that, you're going to see an increased use of proxy forces. And we don't have much of normative frameworks for governing any of that kind of things. There's a couple of legal judgments about proxy forces which literally say that if the patron state doesn't actually tell the proxy to to commit an illegal act, it's off the hook for whatever the proxy does. And that seems, that seems kind of unsatisfying. If you put a proxy in the state and say, go see to my interests, or in an environment, go see to my interests, and it crosses the line and you don't do anything about it, you probably should be held responsible for that kind of behavior. And you're already seeing lots of examples of that happening, and I think you're going to see a lot of pressure and effort to kind of regulate that. And so I think that's where we're headed. When it comes to the just war tradition, I think when it comes to conventional conflicts, we have a pretty well fleshed out set of norms, and the real issue is adherence and enforcement. What I'm really interested right now is actually constructing an actual philosophy of war. I don't see much of that out there. Sure, there's Clausewitz and Sun Tzu, and they say some philosophical things about war, but there's not much out there that really attacks war from the metaphysical and meta-ethical perspective. Or addresses war and war fighting, and more importantly, competition. And I think that's real fruitful areas for philosophical research, which will help, help give us the tools to clarify policy. In fact, in setting this up, I was talking to someone at an Army headquarters, and their response was, this would be something like this would be very useful, because here I am, a planner, and I'm planning all these things, but I don't really know for what. I just know that it's competition. I just know that it's about, or that I know that it's to be part of a warfighting campaign, but I don't really know how to because it's not war the way I commonly understand it, or we have this ideal sense of what it is. I can't always match that, that military objective to the political goal. And if you have the sort of intellectual cognitive tools to put all that together and that kind of understanding, you're going to make a lot better policy. You're going to make a lot better decisions on how to achieve those political objectives. That is one of the areas of a lot of debate in just war theory, different theories, is what are the rights of combatants? And so the current status of all that is if an enemy, so there's three categories of people on the battlefield, basically. Your people, friendly soldiers, enemy soldiers, and non-combatants. And we don't worry about whether those non-combatants are, from an ethical standpoint, we don't worry about whether those non-combatants, what side they're on, what country they belong, what state or organization they're affiliated with. They're protected. And so we already have, so embedded in the law and ethics of war is no direct targeting of non-combatants. And even if when you're attacking enemy force and you know that that non-combatants are going to be exposed to harm, you can only use force that's proportional to the value of the military objective. So that's one right there. Now, and when it comes to soldiers, it's a little different. And there's not much in terms of that, but I'll cover the big area in just a second. But once they surrender or incapacitated, they take on a non-combatant status, and then those protections apply. So if a soldier's surrendering or is no longer able to fight, so you have to take that into consideration. The only other place where it really that I can think of where it really where there are further considerations in your use of weapons, right? So there are some weapons that are just illegal. And even for some weapons, they may not be illegal, but they're just so horrible, you probably shouldn't use them. So there's a sort of principle of, you're free, you're permitted to kill, but inflicting unnecessary suffering, however you're doing that, is also wrong. So you have to take that into consideration. Now, that's sort of that idealized conventional war paradigm. In irregular conflicts or in competition where there might be the potential for force, you probably have a lot of other things you have to consider, to include not just the avoiding killing non-combatants, but protecting and not just protecting non-combatants, but seeing to their well-being in some way. And we can argue whether that's really an ethical or just an instrumental or a practical norm, because if they're less likely to support the other side if their needs are being met. And then when it comes to enemy soldiers and combatants, in some cases you probably should ask the question: do I actually, do we need to use force here? Do I have alternatives? Am I able to develop the situation in a way that I can remove them as a fighting force without actually, killing them? Because that fits in better with an overall political objective. And the kind of way I like to describe the dividing line, that idealized concept of war I was just talking about occurs when there's no order, right? You have there's no sovereign, there's no nothing that's really going to adjudicate the conflict between the two sides. They just have to fight it out in order to establish or impose a more orderly relationship. And a lot of this, not just insurgencies and counterinsurgencies, but also in this competition, there is an order, and we have to pay attention to it. And if you use so much force that you start undermining that order, you're just again engaging in self-defeating activities, and that's unethical. So I make the distinction this way: in regular war fighting, you use the most force permissible, given the constraints and limitations of the just war tradition, namely discrimination, proportionality. But when it comes to other environments like competition and regular warfare, you really have to think about using force, the least force possible, to still get the job done, but not be so much that you're undermining that order and civil society. So it's more the difference between a warfighting paradigm and a law enforcement paradigm. And that's when we're talking about use of them and where that scholarship is going. That's a key theme throughout that.